Rethinking, Aging, Disease, Death in the 21st Century. And today we've got a very, very prolific academician, for the plenary session, and his research is multifaceted, multidisciplinary, and we are really looking forward to the talk. And the very title is so intriguing: from love sickness to narrative medicine towards a critical health theory. Now, this very webinar is very, very interesting because it is throwing light on a lot of cultural phenomena behind the biological processes of death, the socio-cultural context, the theories, the practices, the loopholes, the stigmas, misconceptions, and a plethora of other theoretical premises that are coming in together. And we have so many players out here: the governments, the NGOs, the people. You have a lot of and you have to take care of the citizenry. Now, given the pandemic, all this is making it so interesting, and all the topics have been very, very interesting. And without much ado, we are indeed, sir, welcoming you on board, and we are looking forward to your talk. We are so intrigued. We are, in fact, waiting here, agog with anticipation. And sir, it would go about like this: that it's about a 1 hour. That's the total area. I mean, the time frame. So maybe for you, 45 minutes and maybe 10 minutes, or like anything like that. We'll keep for 10 or 15 minutes for taking up some questions. And sir, the rest of the time is yours. Am I audible? Am I heard?
Yes, ma'am. Perfectly fine. Yes. It's going perfectly fine.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So, sir, Professor M.S. Hossain, we would be very, very happy to have you begin the talk. We are waiting for you, and we're really intrigued, and with your presentation, as well as the very topic itself, the selection. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, and thank you both for that generous introduction and for the so-called promise of exploration of something intriguing. Yes, it is going to be an exploration of something intriguing, but of course, what I'm going to talk about is still in a fledgling state, and that will be clear gradually. Before I start the presentation, let me tell that I would like to use PowerPoint. So I believe that I am allowed to screen share.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Fine. Okay. So I will use a PowerPoint due to the rather I should say the novelty and a couple of examples. And so I will use the PowerPoint for my talk. But before I start this talk, I would like to thank the organizing committee for organizing such a time-bound webinar, which is dealing with aging, disease, and death, which is somehow chillingly relevant to the time that we have been going through during this corona pandemic. So I would like to now share the PowerPoint, and let me know if it is visible. So is it visible and workable?
Yes, sir. It's perfectly visible. Yes.
Fine. Okay. So this is the title of my talk: From Love Sickness to Narrative Medicine Towards Critical Health Theory. I would like to start with the underground man. That I would say, let's meet the underground man from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And I'm using the very beginning of this novel. Let's read very quickly. I'm a sick man. I'm a spiteful man. I'm an unattractive man. Arguably, critics called it the most negative CV ever written. Okay, so I'm a sick man. I'm a spiteful man. I'm an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. However, I know nothing at all about my disease and do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it. Now, in order to highlight some of the basic points of the thing, That is, in this novel, the narrator presents himself as a sick man, particularly that he's a spiteful man. The question that I will ask is, what does this sick man connote? Is it a culturally and semantically problematic term? For example, does it mean physical ailment, or does it may also suggest mentally pervert? Then when he says that I believe my liver is diseased, and then says I don't consult a doctor for it, it also takes us to another dimension, that our understanding and conceptualization of disease, is it diagnosable, or is it pathological, or is it based on our belief and our assumption? Then in the second paragraph, he says, I was lying when I said just now that I was a spiteful official. And in this contradiction will continue. Then he carries on. It was not only that I could not become spiteful, I did not know how to become anything. To live longer than 40 years is bad manners, is vulgar, immoral. It may offend, but well, I am 40 plus, so it may sound offensive to me. Who does live beyond 40? Answer that. Sincerely, honestly, I will tell you who do. Fools and worthless fellows. I tell all old men that to their face. All these venerable old men, all these silver-haired and reverend seniors, I mean, well, including I, pardon the aggression in this narrative. I tell the whole world, now comes the twist. I tell the whole world that to its face. I have a right to say so, for I shall go on living to 60 myself, to 70, to 80. And actually this narrator is in his late 40. So this takes us to the issue of aging. And what we understand is that the aging is presented both as a kind of unnecessary thing. On the other hand, it is punctuated by some paradox, because the narrator wants to live 80 or 90 years. And then comes, stay, let me take breath. This is something which I find most interesting and which is particularly relevant to my today's talk. That is, when he says, stay, let me take breath, we understand that this is related to his physicality. That is, it testifies to his lack of breath, which is likely to be related to his liver disease and the corresponding weakness. What is important to note is that how the narrator's disease, that is weakness in breathing, has impacted upon his moods, and how, more importantly, his breathing problem obstructs the flow of the narrative. This is what I would argue that critical health theory may promote. That is, not only the representation of health, aging, and disease, but also how aging and disease correspond to or complement the narrative and narrative structure. The narrator says, stay, let me take breath, but I have to be breathless in order to finish my 45 to 50-minute presentation on critical health theory. My talk will unfold in 4 parts, and these 4 parts are mentioned here so that it can have an easy follow. That is, first I would like to explore critical health theory, then application of critical health theory regarding disease and aging. And I would like to rethink, as Pradeep Padra mentioned in his yesterday talk, that the objective of this webinar is to think radical, to think out of the box. And so I will use critical health theory to rethink disease and aging. And finally, the conclusion, referencing disease and aging in the time of Corona. So the first part of my presentation is titled From Lovesickness to Narrative Medicine, Critical Health Theory, and it will unfold quickly through 5 interactive sections or subsections, we can say. So when we are talking of critical health theory, which is, we can say, a kind of formulation that I am offering, it takes resources from, but it is different from critical medical humanities and critical health humanities. So if we define medical humanities, it is an interdisciplinary field of medicine that connects the creative and intellectual strengths of arts and humanities in medical education with the conviction that arts provide insights and perspectives to the sciences. If we think of health humanities, it is an interdisciplinary field of study that draws on the aspects of creative writing, fine arts, and other humanities discipline in its approach not to medicine, but to health, healthcare, and well-being. Now, if we move into critical medical humanities and critical health humanities, actually which is pertinent to critical health theory, we can say that they are critical because they are political and they are emancipatory in their approach. I mean, the word critical testifies to it. So critical medical and critical health humanities take into consideration the cultural differences and pluralities, as well as aesthetic sensibility and political sensitivity in their exploration of, in their critique and correction of the hierarchies and paternalistic domination, or we can say Eurocentric domination, in medical and healthcare practices. It is taking cues from medical and health humanities that I offer critical health theory. So critical health theory, or we can say CHT, the 20th century witnessed the emergence of influential critical theories ranging from Marxism, psychoanalysis, and feminism to post-colonialism, race and ethnicity studies, gender studies, eco-criticism. And they have had significant impact on the ways we view ourselves, the others, and the world. Thus, when we interpret or represent an individual or a community, we tend to address the issues of class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, psychology. However, what we have lacked is the issue of health. For example, age. In English studies, that is the English department I'm from, we are often interested to delve deep into the human psyche and explore the psychological impact of an event or a bodily interaction, say domestic abuse. In our bid to go beyond the surface, we tend to ignore or forget the surface, the physiological nature of wellness and unhealth, and the ways physiology and psychology interact and interanimate that makes what we become. Recently, literary and critical theories have concentrated on body studies, disability studies, etc., in the study of literature. Again, however, the issues of health, disease, and aging, and the issues of medication, surgery, health humanities are ignored and suppressed. It is in this context that I think the emergence of a health-oriented critical theory is required. I therefore put forward critical health theory. It is a project in the making, so what I'm presenting today is a draft of a theory that is in its fledgling state. If I want to define, so critical health theory, or CHT, is critical intervention in the relationship and interanimation of literature and health, healthcare, and medicine across culture and history. It entails critical analysis of the terms human and health. It is conducted in a spirit of commitment to healthcare, health, and medical praxis on the planetary level. It promises to offer sophisticated ways of interrogating and theorizing the relation between literature and health, healthcare, and medicine. It is likely to render our understanding of health and disease more nuanced and our performance in healthcare more emphatic and effective. So, critical health theory is different subtly from psychoanalysis. First, by critical health theory's concentration on physiology. Second, by its ethical stance that is concerned for the other. And third, by its cross-cultural approach that intends to make connections and learn from the others. CHT has also distinguished itself from medical and health humanities with its chief focus on the critical affective theorization and aesthetic representation of health, healthcare, and medicine in literature. For example, CHT approaches catharsis and ethico-medical impact of tragedy through a medical lens. On the other hand, CHT approaches love sickness, a pseudo-scientific experience that is feeling of affliction or great suffering that occurs when someone's love interest is absent, or when one's love is unrequited. Prevalent since the Middle Ages, there was even a French treatise on love sickness by Jacques Vaughan. The cover page of the book is given here. Love sickness, however, is rarely taken seriously in medical and psychological studies, but it appears significantly in art and literature. So critical health theory, unlike medical humanities, will approach love sickness. Critical health theory also approaches fever, but not only as a theme in literature, but also as its function in structuring a poem or structuring a novel that we will see later in this presentation. And CHT addresses a core element of health humanities, narrative medicine. That is how health caregivers, even physicians, can use or write narration. That is the stories of individual patients. This narrative medicine can both validate or authenticate a patient's experience, and it may also develop self-reflection at the part of the physician. Now, it is with this short formulation of what I call critical health theory, I will venture outlining very briefly the three basic premises, some issues, and 6 approaches in critical health theory. So just to recall that critical health theory is a health-oriented approach to study literature. So if we think of the 3 premises of critical health theory, the first premise is that CHT adopts a health-centered approach to literary studies. For example, it foregrounds the physicality of experience and the pathology of health condition. CHT contends that our physiological and psychological behaviors are much conditioned by our health, for example, our sickness and illness, and the network of medication, surgery, and healthcare. The second premise is that literature and health issues interanimate. For example, illness like fever or schizophrenia. Illness structures literary narratives, for example, Arabic fever narratives. And illness can structure narrative technique, as we have noted in Dostoevsky. While on the other hand, aging determines or may determine the style and voice of a Bildungsroman. If we recall Joyce's The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, we will recall that the language and voice in the first chapter, which is from the perspective of a child, is very much different from the language and voice in the 5th chapter, which is from the perspective of a more matured man. So aging somehow determines the style of Bildungsroman, a point that we often ignore. On the other hand, literatures too may condition illness and may structure healthcare. For example, exposure to literary representation of trauma and violence may renew victimhood in a reader who was once brutally abused. On the other hand, writing and reading of inspiring narratives or suffering narratives can work on readers as medicine or immunity. The third premise is this, that CHT accommodates an ethical imperative, that is concern for the other, the cultural or racial or sexual other. So in its study of literature, critical health theory takes insights from cross-cultural psychology and resources from diatopical hermeneutics. Thus, when a German critic, for example, studies Okonkwo's treatment of his daughter's Iba or fever in Achebe's Things Fall Apart, a critical health theorist will refrain from labeling African medical policies as backdated or inauthentic. Instead, they will address the cultural differences, they will learn from the other, and they will foreground the political sensitivity in order to critique and subvert the hierarchies and paternalistic domination in the practice of life and the practice of healthcare. So with these three premises, I will move into the outlining of the major issues in critical health theory. And I will offer 21 major issues. I'm not going to discuss each and everything, but some. For example, the issues of birth and birthing. Uh, Critical health theory involves critical studies based on the health and medical care. The critical studies on the process and feelings of birthing, the representation of birthing. Is it a woman only experience? What about the pregnant protagonists? What about mother mortality and childbirth? For example, if we think of William Faulkner's novel As I Lay Dying, there we will find the woman, the female protagonist who lies dying. She thinks or rethinks motherhood in these words. And when I knew I had cash, cash is her first child. And when I knew that I had cash, I knew that living was terrible and that this was the answer to it. Because she wants freedom, but now through motherhood, she feels that she becomes trapped. That was when I learned that words are no good, that words don't ever fit, even what they're trying to set. When he was born, I knew that motherhood was invented by someone who had to have a word for it because the ones that had the children did not care whether there was a word for it or not. The point is that here the focus is not only on the semantic complexities, but also how semantic is inextricably related to bodily experience. The question is whether it is a woman exclusive experience and how we will read it from or through woman's perspective and a neutral perspective. The second issues in CHT could be becoming adult and, for example, childhood abuse and suicidal tendency. Understandably, gerontology is a major issue. So we may talk about literary gerontology. That is the study of the representation of old age and aging and their socio-cultural implications. Critical health theory involves the issues of old age and aging, philosophizing and theorizing and interrogating old age and aging, age as a motif and metaphor, issues of senility, infirmity, immobility, the anxiety of the loss of beauty, resisting aging, for example, through memorializing, through burial, the issues of medicine, hospital, nursing, expense related to aging and sickness, and also the issues of old home. The fourth is disease, that is suffering due to malfunctioning organism within the body itself. And it may cover the issues of plague, endemic, pandemic, STDs, including HIV, neurosis, psychological and physiological disorder caused by sexual violence. It will involve illness, physical and mental. Illness is an experience of unhealth, unlike disease. And not necessarily illness is caused by diseases. So it involves the issues of fever, delusion, hallucination, hysteria, etc. Then comes the issue of sickness. Sickness is different from illness, as sickness is said is about the external and public mode of unhealth. So that is the socio-cultural conception of unhealth. So CHT involves critical studies on the terms like sick and pervert, the issues of fear and rejection that define a patient's behaviors and others' behaviors towards the patients, the ways the patients are stigmatized, otherized, ostracized, and presently we are familiar with the term, the quarantined, and the politics behind it. CHT involves love and love sickness. CHT involves death and dying. For example, the images of dying in, say, Emily Dickinson's poem. But here the focus is on the physiological properties. It may also study the beliefs and rituals of burial. It may study zombies, dead men walking, werewolf, and vampires vis-a-vis the practice of healthcare and burial management and the conception of afterlife. CHT may study the decay, the philosophizing decay, representation of decomposition. It may study the representation of the smell of corpse, necrophilia, necrophobia, and how we resist the decay of the body. For example, the pyramid and the mummies. It may discuss sexuality and, for example, the physical properties of sexuality, like erectile dysfunction and sexual promiscuity, and gender, particularly the gender dimension of aging. It may also discuss disability from the medical and health perspectives, like the issues of immobility. It may discuss deviation, for example, studies on health-related practices that are deemed transgressive or pervert. For example, masturbation viewed as detrimental to health or sin in some societies, and how literatures represent it or not represent it. The issues of medicine, that is how doctors, how medicinal procedures are represented, whether medicine has its impact on the body and mind of a character, the ambivalence of pharmacon as both poison and antidote, even the issues of love potion that we find in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. It may involve issues of healthcare and counseling, for example, nursing, as we witness in Hemingway's novel Farewell to Arms and Shani Muthu's novel Sirius Blooms at Night. It may include belief and value systems, for example, how in many African and Asian novels, spirituality informs medical and healthcare, which stands in contrast to the diagnosis-based treatment policy in the West. It may include gastronomy. For example, a critical health theory may study the representation of feasts and festivals, fooding, overeating, hierarchy and marginalization related to food habit, culture and religious issues, for example, haram and halal, and the issues of different conceptualization of stomach in different societies. For example, among the Songhai in Mali and Niger, knowing is perceived, not in terms of viewing, like I see means I know. Rather, knowing is perceived in terms of consumption. Therefore, stomach or belly is considered to be a seat of personality. And therefore, when they say study history, they say they eat the words of the ancestors. This cultural approach may add more meaning to what Achebe wrote in Things Fall Apart when he says that among the Igbo, proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. So this expression has much to do with the stomach-centric epistemology evident in Africa. CHT may study the physiological behavior. This is an important point, that in representing and reading the impact of say, sexual violence on a character, we look for the impact of the victim-survivor psychology. Thus, we tend to forget the physiological behavior that will tell us a lot about the victim-survivor's bodily and mental agonies. For example, overeating, late sleeping in the morning, even diarrhea, might be the symptoms of a character's being raped. Equally significant is to explore the invisibilization, the lack of representation of urination and defecation in literature, as well as the corresponding disorder caused by sexual violence. CHT may offer a study of suffering and the suffering narratives. It may study non-human illness too, because in this age of increasing Anthropocene, we witness an increasing separation between the human and the non-human. So CHT may expand its approach and may address non-human illness. That is, whether and how literature represents animal illness and re-accentuates the lost connection. For example, the speaker in the Irish poet Dorothy Molloy's poem Curate finds her pained body connected to a dog, quote, a pedigree bitch like myself, unquote. And the last point that I would like to mention is the violence and injuries. In our traditional study, because physical injuries are too visible, we often explore the psychic wounds or that a violent act entails. Often do we say that physical wounds heal, mental wounds remain. Such approach surely merits attention, that is, studying mental wounds. But it tricks us to ignore the impact, the bodily impact of physical injuries. A critical health reading of the rape of Piccola in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye may expose whether and why the impact, the physical, palpable impact of violence on the body is sidetracked. So these are, we can say, the major issues that CHT explores and opens up new areas. This takes me to the fourth section of the first section, that is the major approaches in critical health theory. I just outline the 6 approaches in critical theory, that is the aesthetics, that is the theorizing and philosophizing the relevant issues, the poetics, that is how will critical health theory study. For example, critical close reading of the words and the critical close reading of the narrative structure, narrative tone. Third is the ethics, that is how a particular, that is our responsibility towards the other. That is how a particular disease and its consequences are represented, whether that disease is demonized and whether the patients are demonized, whether we connect pregnancy and abortion to law and morality and healthcare, and how literature represents abortion from which perspective. Politics is the 6th approach, the 4th approach in CHT, and it is used to explore the cultural construction of disease, health, healing, the connection between disease and spirituality, disease and imperialism, disease and civilization, how the concept of odor or bad smell is culturally constructed, how odorizing is often used to otherize, how the issues of sanitization, of hygiene, are related to social class, urbanity, and it is not related. It is not necessarily democratic. For example, the novel Untouchable. The 5th approach is diagnostics. That is, critical health theory will also diagnose or read the diagnosis of diseases and illnesses. So it may study literary representation of disease and medication to explore which diseases are prominent, say, in Indian literature and why, and how, for example, the human interaction with living and the non-living beings are presented. And the 6th approach is therapeutics. That is, whether literature has anything to do with therapy, with its writing process, its reading process. That is how illness can offer a narrative structure. On the other hand, how reading literature can offer therapy, can offer immunity. How, for example, disease, spirituality, and science are interconnected. And how, for example, a more diagnostic and therapeutic discussion of FERT. We know that FERT, pardon the example, that is FERT has also an art form. That is the FERT, that is there are FERTists who use their ability to release FERT in a different ways so as to narrate a story. So therefore, critical health studies may lead us to different approaches, different studies related to health, healthcare, and medicine. This is, I can say, the basic of my today's talk. Now, in the next 15 minutes, I will apply this critical health theory that I proposed in order to rethink disease and to rethink aging. So the title of my second, the second part of my talk is Stay, Let Me Take Breath, Rethinking Disease. in this section, I would like to argue or show that critical health theory may productively explore which diseases are represented in literature and which diseases are not represented or invisibilized in literature. Thus, it may help us investigate the societal taboos as well as indigenous conceptualization of an ailment as disease. A critical health reading of the representation of frequency of a disease and child mortality in a text is likely to tell us much about the society. For example, Achebe in Things Fall Apart implies, through a love story of Ear and Mosquito, if we recall that, through that love story of Ear and Mosquito, Achebe in Things Fall Apart implies that the high rate of child mortality in the pre-colonial Igbo society in Nigeria was due to malaria. If representation of disease is an issue, the other issues is narrativizing as a healing mechanism. That is how narrativizing, or how the process of narration may heal the writer or may heal the narrator protagonist of a novel. A good example of which is the way the underground man in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground uses diaries to organize his incoherent thoughts. On the other hand, writing a narrative may also help a physician or a caregiver, as I mentioned before, which is proposed by Rita Sharon in her enumeration of narrative medicine. So if we think of rethinking, if we want to rethink the interanimation of disease and literature, and which will fit the objective of this webinar, I will isolate two areas that critical health theory may explore. First, the compositional dimension, which includes a critical survey of the ways narrator's illness can affect the narrative tone and point of view of a novel, and how fever or an illness can structure narrative. The second is the hermeneutic dimension, which covers two issues. First, how reading inspiring literatures or suffering narratives may offer readers psychic immunity, and also how narratives facilitate healing practices, that is narrative medicine. Today I will elaborate on one, that is fever narratives. That is how fever structures our narrative. But we understand that fever informs literary and extra-literary narratives, sometimes as the major motive, sometimes as narrative structure. Francesca Polletta, in her 2016 book, It Was Like a Fever, Storytelling in Protest and Politics, demonstrated how good stories can be effectively used to mobilize social and political movements. She referred to a series of spontaneous sit-ins by African American students in the 1960s America that spread, in the words of the students, like a fire. Today, however, my focus is on the second, rather a more radical approach to fever, that is how fever structures a narrative. And for this, I will take into account a poem by Al-Mutanabbi, a famous Abbasid Arab poet from the present-day Iraq. I mean, he was born in the present Iraq, but he was from more than 1,000 years back. In his iconic poem, known as Qasida al-Hama, or the fever poem, Al-Mutanabbi offers an intimate account of the way fever consumes him. What is interesting is to notice that fever also provides a structure to the poem. Rawat Zahivebe, in his study on fever dreams, narrative destructuring in Arabic literature, contents that fever in Al-Mutanabbi's poem is presented as a state of perpetual liminality that corresponds to and replaces the Rahil, a section of Qasida. To clarify the point, I will briefly concentrate on 2 points based on Rawat's reading. First, a typical Qasida has a tripartite structure. First comes the Nasib, which contains the poet's mourning for the loss of the beloved. Then comes the middle section, Rahil, in which the poet sets out on a journey. And finally, the garad, or the actual purpose of the qasida, offering self-praise or strong criticism of the others. Thematically, as per Susan Stetski's study, the nasib relates to separation, the rahil to liminality or transition, and garad to aggregation or addition. If this is so, it is in the rahil section, the middle section, that the poet encounters harsh physical and psychological conditions that transform his body physiologically and symbolically. It is this bodily experience of liminality that connects the rahil to fever. How? Rahat, in his essay, presented a semantic map of the Arabic word hama, meaning fever. Well, does it remind us of A.R. Rahman's song Hamma Hamma? Well, if we translate the apparently gibberish words Hamma Hamma into fever fever, well, it may now add some meaning to the song. It arguably means fever fever. That is love sickness or love fever. So, well, so Hama or Huma in Arabic may connote both poison, something that harms, that burns, and anecdote, something that protects. So Rawat thus conceptualized fever as an experience that simultaneously threatens the life of the afflicted, while it serves as the body's mechanism of defense, leads to renewal. It may remind us of those famous lines from Abu Nuwah's poems on wine that foregrounds the ambivalence and liminality of disease. And heal me with that which is the illness. Now, the rahil, that is the middle section of a qasida, and fever have one thing in common, liminality. And here comes the most interesting point. In Qasida al-Hama, al-Mutanabi, or the poet persona, due to his fever, is unable to undertake the journey that should happen in the second section, Rahil. So what we find in the poem is that the speaker, who is on his bed and therefore immobile, is also moving, but this movement is on his bed, which is characterized by an erratic back and forth motion embodied by his tossing and turning in bed due to high fever. The poem reads, "Of me the bed has tired, when before resting my side for its annual session would nauseate me. Sick body, unable to stand, completely wasted, with no wine at hand." So fever here appears as a double-edged experience that on the one hand leaves the poet unable to move physically, while on the other it makes the poet, or it allows the poet to imagine the rahil, which generates movement through flashbacks. For Rawat Zahi Vebe, if rahil serves as a transition from arrested development to reaffirmation of social bonds, fever too is a liminal stage that transitions the patient passenger from sickness to death. Thus, we can say that fever substitutes the second section, the rahil of the qasida. This is how fever structures a narrative. We will surely find it interesting if we expand it and find that fever informs the structure of a number of contemporary Lebanese civil war novels, which include Rashid al-Daif's The Tyrant and Huda Barakat's Sayyidi wa Habibi, or My Master, My Lover. This takes me to the third and last part of my presentation, that is rethinking aging through critical health theory. Now, in this part, that is senescence and literature, I show that in literature, old age and aging typically appear as motifs and metaphors to suggest regression, anti-progression, decline, and decay. For example, the motif known as carpe diem, that is seize the day, which is unevocally premised upon some negative assumptions of aging as decline. We find Robert Herrick's poem To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, which starts with the famous statement, "Gather ye rosebuds while you may," presents aging as decline, and in sharp contrast with youth. Quoting, "That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worse times still succeed the former." Similar attitude might be evident in Rabindranath Tagore's invocation of youth power in his Bangla poem Shobujer Obhijan, Adventures of the Youth. The problem emerges when the celebration of young as a rebel involves dismissing old age as conservative and reactionary, that is, in decline. It is in the second stanza, Oije Probin, Oije Porom Paka. Somehow, if I translate it, it means that there sits the old, the matured, with its wings covering both eyes and ears, drowsing, as if in a still picture. Thus, our veneration of youth and the corresponding regressive rhetoric of ageism have the potential to reduce old age to an unwelcome and unholy phase of life which is in decline, and thus may endanger the living of the aged people. However, it is since the 1970s, probably due to the increase in the life expectancy of old people, many contemporary writings have been empathically sensitive to and emphatically corrective in the invisibilization or disempowering portrayal of old age and aging. Old age and aging have thus become new motifs that suggest the possibility of an opening up of life. A similar approach is evident in narratives also. One may recall the 2015 Bangla film from Kolkata, Bela Sheshe. So, Simone de Beauvoir, in her 1972 study on old age, intended to break the conspiracy of silence that surrounds the discussion of old age. She reasons, if we do not know what we are going to be, we cannot know what we are. So let us recognize ourselves in this old man or that old woman. Unquote. Now, to fit the theme of this conference, I will isolate two gerontological areas that critical health theory may explore. First, the compositional dimension, which includes critical survey of contemporary novels of aging and dementia narratives. And second, the hermeneutic dimension, which covers the use of literature by the carers and physicians who take care of old people, and what I propose, gerontologic reading. It is an age-oriented reading which focuses on the ways how old people interpret and respond to the representations of old age and youth in literature. Today, I will concentrate on one, the contemporary novels that trace aging, which will take me to the end of my presentation. That is aging narratives. Diana Wallace, in her study on the literary portrayals of aging, demonstrates how contemporary Western fiction and critical study have self-consciously interrogated the process of aging. For example, Celeste Luckman, in her 1977 study on the literature of senescence, senescence meaning deterioration with age, she noted how old age became central in several novels by Muriel Spark and Saul Bellow, but they focus on the inevitable process of degeneration and decay of old age. And we will find a kind of movement from this approach to several new approaches. For example, the midlife progress novel proposed by Margaret Goulet. She says that the midlife progress novel counters the negative ideology of aging with plots that suggest the possibility of progress or renewal during and after the midlife of one's life. And yes, okay. This takes us to the third kind of genre, like Raven's Roman. It was proposed by Barbara Waxman. It is translated as Novel of Ripening, which affirms a more empowering approach to the treatment of aging in contemporary fiction. Several novels, for example, May Sartan's As We Are Now and Doris Lessing's The Summer Before the Dark, employ a narrative voice that draws the reader into the aging protagonist's world and make creative use of dreams or flashbacks as spatial mechanisms used for life review. 2 years later, Constance Rook proposed a different term, Boledang's-Roman, or novel of winding up. She approached disengagement or the deconstruction of ego in old age. These novels, she argued, for example, Margaret Lawrence's The Stone Angel, these novels strive to discover some kind of affirmation in the face of loss. Rook shows how the use of the first-person narrative allows the bad-tempered 90-year-old Hagar to tell her own story, which thus counters the invisibility or marginalization of old people, their reduction to stereotype. This takes us to the 2-minute conclusion of my talk, that is a health turn. So what I discussed in this section in my talk is how literature and health coalesce. We understand that this international webinar is immensely important and it has brought into focus 3 issues: aging, disease, and death. Issues that the current corona pandemic has chillingly brought to prominence and profoundly and disgustingly affected our mental and physical health. We have also witnessed the immense importance of literature and other narratives to survive these traumatic days. I'm happy that it is in this context that I am making my first presentation on what I dubbed critical health theory. That is critical intervention in the relationship and interanimation of literature and healthcare and medicine across culture and history. In my talk, I isolated 2 issues and demonstrated how critical health theory can open new grounds to rethink disease and rethink aging. For the young generation, for the youth-invested contemporary rhetoric of life and living, old age appears as an other, a foreign country. In May Sartan's words, old age is a foreign country with an unknown language to the young and even to the middle-aged. It is a foreign country that probably no one wants to get a visa for. That we, when we are young or middle-aged, probably even when we are old, we tend to ignore and ridicule aging and reduce it into something that we are happy to avoid. That we do this is a testimony to our confirmed knowing that all of us will, apart from some accidents, that all of us will, today and tomorrow, will eventually land in that foreign country, that another country. The another is simply an other of us. This takes me to the end of my presentation. But here, before I close my talk, I must mention that I dedicate my today's presentation to my mother, my Amma Mahmuda Begum Poli, a spirited individual. She, in her late 70s, is extraordinary. She is extraordinarily active in her household and related chores, as well as in communicating through conversation and writing her ideas and insights on numerous areas, from the Hindi serial Anupama to contemporary vaccine nationalism. Now, by dedicating this presentation to her name, I would like to celebrate the spirit of continuity and renewal that physical aging cannot stop. And to add a twist, I would like to request her
Sir, you are muted, sir. Sir,
Yeah,
unmute
sir, you
yourself.
muted yourself.
no,
Sir,
I
you are
was
muted
actually
yourself.
calling
No,
my
he has
mother.
done
Yes,
that.
I'm actually
He
calling
has
my
done
mother.
it on purpose. He's
Yes,
calling his
yes,
mother.
yes.
Yes.
So by dedicating this presentation to her name, I would like to celebrate the spirit of continuity and renewal that physical aging cannot stop. So here she is, my mother, to say hello.
Namaskar, namaskar.
That's wonderful.
Okay, she was very reluctant to be here, but okay, I somehow made her join here. Yeah,
That's
thank
lovely.
you, Amma Mahmouda Begum Poli. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, the organizing committee and Borolan University to invite me to make my speech here on critical health theory. Thank you.
So, Professor Hossain, I would like to say that we have been, you said this was your first, presentation of critical health theory. Frankly speaking, we have been entranced. We were intrigued. But now we are deeply, deeply involved with your talk. It has been so fascinating. And the gamut of areas that you have covered, it was... it was very great the way you began with notes from the underground. Perhaps that was the actual symbolic way in which you are approaching the whole thing. You've really dug out the nuances from underground, things which we have left buried. I think that is what you have done. You have picked out, and I must commend you on the fact that there is so many areas. You've put it together, networked it, with literary, not just literature, so multidisciplinary and so important. But first of all, before I go on about your talk, we have been indeed very touched to have your mother on board, and we share and we pass on our respects, and indeed she's an inspiration to all of us. So love from all of us, love and respects and pranams from all of us, which is a way of greeting. And it is this, you're very, I would say this is what has been so heart-touching about the entire beautiful talk, which is very critical, very literary, very deep, but bringing on your mother was the most beautiful gesture, and I'm so happy that I happened to be chairing this session where I was able to witness this. And you have given that reality about renewal, about growth. And I guess that is the attitude shift which you are looking towards. The serious purpose of your talk is to have that attitudinal shift, because that is the problem, the Western approach, or in many approaches, as you've gone into so much detail, the detailed nuances of growing old, the little details. A Saul Bellow novel would certainly bring it out. But, you have gone into so many, the beautiful Qasida, you have mentioned the poems over there, and the transition, how you have the tripartite structure, and how, your fever narratives, that was very, very unusual. The way I would say that after looking through your, analysis, it has given us, and I think to every scholar on board this conference, it is giving us so many ideas of approaching, critical health care. It's a totally genre, just like sci-fi fiction. This accounts for a serious discussion. And what I liked most was the way you have given those 21 areas, they are so carefully selected, each and every one. You've even gone into necrophilia and things like that. You've looked into it from the esoteric point of view, from the spiritual point of view. You bring in a galaxy of writers like Faulkner and everyone, because, you have Yeats, who's very popular, his take on old age, a tattered coat upon a stick, which kind of brings out that derogatory, that kind of, attitude, which is kind of latent, and, levels and levels of meaning you have there. But what was most interesting was when you talked about the Igbo concept, Chinua Achebe's, and you had also talked about the fact that in some way, when they look at, sickness or disease or aging and the narratives, in a sense that we are partaking of it. It's becoming a part, it's like we're assimilating it. This was very, very intriguing. Again, I should use the word intriguing because I would say this in every bit of your diagnosis, it is almost like a diagnosis. Your critical health theory is a diagnosis, okay? It is not less than a medical document. And I found, especially when you talked about, various things, the take of women, the gender issues, the sexuality, the gastronomy. You have brought in everything to explain, aging, death, disease. These are things which we see in a novel, but we don't really, underpin it or look at it. And, by beginning with Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, and the way you picked up that passage, that was a master stroke. You say, and finally I breathe, and then only we say, what's going on? And, oh God, even to breathe. And then slowly we realize that this is about illness. And I think that was so important because all three areas, aging, illness, and death, all three were encapsulated in that very first paragraph. Okay, that I think was a master stroke to put it there, because then only we realize the person is not, he's hoping to live. It's not that he's wanting to die at 40. I'm spiteful, so let me die at 40. And also the attitude, the way he says that only fools, And even Shakespeare, if you notice, has been very, very derogatory about, age. I would say it is one of the terror, you feel sick, almost. And yet it's so realistic because each writer is bringing up that area. And in the last part, which I found very interesting, was about, this word, like your Bildungsroman, you talked about the Bildungsroman, like, they are also narratives of aging, and how you come to terms with that. That was a very, very interesting thing. And the Volendungsroman, which is the novel of kind of making a kind of a shift, a more gentle shift. And I think one thing you have done by this very, I would say, in-depth study is that. Can you hear me, please? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, there was a shift out here. So what I found was that this kind of an in-depth study has, kind of made us really look at this subject. And it is very, very true that this has not been given enough or adequate attention at all. That is why critical health theory, I think, it's like almost like a master thesis, because it's like you are giving us the nuances, the in detail, representation of death, of narrative as healing mechanisms, of rethinking, and the interanimation of disease and literature. But this is very, very interesting. And unless you've gone deep into it and looked at it from so many angles, I guess we wouldn't have got so much out of it. Now, there is enormous number of questions that have come up, and I would like to, because I have been personally very, very influenced, affected, and enriched by this talk of yours. So I would personally say I enjoyed it. I congratulate you. And if this is your first talk, I think this is going to be the foundation of many on critical health theory. I think it's just the beginning of something that comes to a totally new level. So I would like to, there's been some very interesting questions. I would like you to take them on, okay? Because we do have time, so we can go to it. So may I request you to, Pratisha, could you kindly, go back to some of the first questions which were there?
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I would love to do that.
Yeah.
Dr. Rohila Hanupriya Rohila, she's one of the participants. She comments, I congratulate the speaker for such an engrossing talk I request him to deliberate upon the relation between the CHT and the informal caregivers or family members. Though he has mentioned once or twice about the caregivers during this presentation, but I wish to know more about the situation of the family caregivers in critical health theory, if it is so. Also wish to know if the critical disability theory differs from critical health theory.
Yes.
And another
Let
question.
it be one at a time. Professor,
let me-
let's
yeah.
answer one at a time.
Let me
Okay.
take these.
First time.
There are actually two questions there. One is the relation between the critical health theory and the informal caregivers, uh, and that is of family members. Uh, First of all, let us recall that what I'm talking about is actually a literary theory from a critical perspective. So when we are addressing the issues of informal caregivers, we are actually taking into account the representation of informal caregivers in literary texts, or in extension, we can say also films and other arts. The critical health theory can provide us tools and mechanisms to approach, number one, the way, for example, the informal caregivers are presented as indifferent to, say, an old mother or father, and they may send them to old home. For example, the very famous song by Nochiketa about Vridhashram. So those songs, somehow the question is how these songs or how these literary writings represent the patient or the old people on the one hand and the caregivers on the other. Since the focus is on not on the psychology, but rather the focus is on the physiological properties and physiological functions, so we need to think of other issues as well. That is the healthcare, the expenses related to the person, the expense related to sending an old mother or an old father to old home. And it is also important to take into account that how sending a person to old home may involve expense which might be higher than putting her or keeping her or him at home. So the question that critical health theory may invoke is that in spite of the high expense that sending an old mother to old home, why do these people opt for it instead of keeping the mother at home? And that may open up some new areas or ways of understanding, rather than simply reducing the old woman as vulnerable and children as demonic. Since I presented my mother has a notion that she would like to live like at her early 70s and now late 70s. She prefers staying at old home, but she wants to stay at old home not because she's unhappy with us or with me, but because she thinks that we, that is the children, have different ways of thinking and living, and she somehow feels that she might obstruct that flow. But she does not or may not venture that thing because the society may therefore blame the children, that because of the children she visits old home, while she actually volunteers going old home, both because she is a widow, so might be she wants to have a better communication with similar aged people, and also to have her own way, and so that no one like me or anyone, even within, ever feel that she becomes a burden. Now, when we think of old home, we rarely address these issues that an old person may volunteer going or frequenting old home, and it may not have much to do with the carelessness or of the informal caregiver. The second point I will answer briefly, that is the relation or difference between critical disability theory or disability studies and critical health theory. It is understandable that critical disability studies is particularly premised upon disability, but critical health theory has a larger area. But again, critical health theory has its focus on the physiological properties, that is, the issues of health, healthcare, and medicine, rather than on psychology. I mean, it involves psychology, but its focus is on the physiological property. Yes, I think there is another question, Pratusha.
Sir, she, it's like, I think it's already addressed, but she was commenting. My first question is with special reference to the
No.
informal caregivers of the elderly or aging family members.
Yes, Pratusha, that is done. I think it's something from
Yes.
Prakash Pokhrel.
Prakash Pokhrel.
Yes,
Yes.
Yes.
Prakash Pokhrelji, he asked, sir, through such discourse about death or dying, are we actually reframing the negative social construct of death or symbolically showing it as very beautiful?
Interesting question, but of course I did not cover this area, and therefore I used rethinking disease and rethinking aging, not rethinking death, because that will take us to very many issues. But of course, since you asked this question, the question is whether death is an ugly thing, or whether do we consider it as ugly or beautiful. But I refer to casually the representation of dying that we find in Emily Dickinson's poems. And I know there are many people like me who love Emily Dickinson's poetry. And while many of her poems are about the process of dying, not about death, but about the process of dying, particularly that beautiful poem when a person is dying and then a fly buzzes, and that's the single sound of buzzing somehow makes her or him makes him want to live the life again. So the question is whether the conception of death is culturally constructed. I may venture that yes, it is. There are several ethnicities in the world who cry when a child is born, and who laugh or celebrate when a person is dead. Their perception is this, that this life is a phase of struggle. So when a child is born, actually the child enters this life of struggle, and so they cries and laments, and also provide support so that he or she survives. And when a person dies, so this is his or her living this phase of struggle and to some unknown place, and therefore they celebrate. So therefore our very understanding or conceptualization of death is, we can say, culturally constructed. So we cannot simply say that death is necessarily ugly, but of course we cannot say that critical health theory tries to or will try to represent death as something very beautiful. I mean, these conceptions of beautiful and ugly are problematic, but we can say that critical health theory may offer spaces in which dying may appear as a part of life, as Bildungsroman makes us aware of. So if Bildungsromans end in death of a person, as we find in V.S. Naipaul's The House for Mr. Bishash, it starts with the birth of the baby, of the person, and it ends with the death of the person. So it covers the whole life, and thus very much like the birth, the death appears as an event, as a part of life, rather than beautiful or ugly. So maybe critical health theory opens up such approaches. First is the cultural understanding of death and decay, and on the other hand, the understanding of death as a part of the process in life cycle.
Professor Hossain, if I may intervene a moment, just now the question was on the death, the beauty, or the ugliness, something like that. So there is some. It reminds me of the poems by Baudelaire, the Fleur du Mal, where you find Baudelaire always felt that ugliness, death, decay. He kind of in his poetry, that is what he had very clearly spoken about, because he said when a generation is faced with more ugliness and death and decay, that becomes a subject matter for poetry. So the thing is that I think what actually what is very, very hard hitting is the element of decay and degeneration rather than death per se. That is what, if you ever talk about ugliness or something like that, it is visualizing that arena, which I think becomes very traumatic.
Yes,
I think
it's not only visualizing. It also involves smell, because
exactly. You had gone into a lot of details.
yeah,
Yes,
that is
you have done that.
decomposition. Yeah.
Yes.
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 So decay. That is
The clinical aspect, almost. It is with clinical
Yes.
precision. You have really, dissected the
Yes.
aspect.
So that I want to actually highlight a program that that is a diagnosis. Yes. I did not use the word, but of course I will use the word later. That is that somehow thematically and stylistically connects. So yes, in this diagnosis of literature, we find that um, decay actually starts with the beginning of the midlife, and that actually the starts of the senescence, and that reaches its culmination in old age. And after the death, there also the issue of decomposition. For example, the issues of burial, issues of grave, and even the burial process, whether you burn or what you do, and all these have the cultural elements, the traditions, and that also tells, and also there are the issues of mummy that also does not let them decompose. So there are many issues. The question is, when you say the Baudelaire and the ugliness and decay and death, of course, death, decay, decomposition, all these somehow resonate. The sense of ugliness in the sense because it gives us the feel, the notion that we will be decaying, since we know that this is an inevitable truth or fact. So somehow psychologically and by ignoring or separating ourselves from the old, psychologically and physiologically, by makeup, by using the anti-aging cream, by using hair dye on to cover our gray hair. So both publicly and mentally, through the physiological practices, we try to avoid, as if we can actually avoid. So of course, that we want to avoid somehow suggests that yes, we consider that ugly. If not ugly, we consider that as something avoidable. But again, the reason that I presented my mother. So does it necessarily mean that we consider our aged parents as ugly or as this? So somehow we negotiate between these conceptions of ugliness generated from our fear and anxiety, and also the actual confrontation with that old age and decay, when we particularly encounter have the intimate encounter with your father, mother, or relatives, even the aged spouse. So we negotiate. So I think it's through negotiation that we come to terms with this trauma or anxieties of decay, death, ugliness, and beauty.
So basically what I find is that we are moving into the unseen, uncovering those spaces, which have been left kind of invisible, and we come to terms with it because of the element of recognition, and also it is a kind of, it's a futuristic projection because it is inevitable, because and that's what it makes sense, because that's why Camus felt that the only important question in life was the question of death, and that it is when you're close to death that you truly understand everything. So I guess it's been very, very interesting. Pratusha, are there any more questions?
No questions, ma'am, but people are appreciating a lot.
Yeah, give us some of the appreciations. Let Professor Hossain know how much he's been appreciated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
okay,
let me read up.
let me also convey the thanks sent to from my mother's part for the thanks that you extended to her.
Thank you, thank you. It has been a very wonderful moment, and we shall all remember this particular webinar because of these, the unusually beautiful element of you bringing in your mother. It's such a spontaneous gesture. Must be a wonderful son. Really wonderful. Okay.
And ma'am, I think it's very symbolic also, right? Like how do we
Yes,
get
it gives us a
across?
lot of, it is like, it is
Yes.
so strange. Here we were grappling with something that was, which
Mm,
was a very truthful thing, but it was a truth which we could barely swallow. It was
yes.
kind of
Yes.
stuck in our throat.
Mm,
And here was a beautiful representation of life, moving on and so grand. It's like a river. You have the stream, and then you have the mighty river moving into the ocean. And when you look at that, you get another dimension. You feel strong, you feel energized, you say, yes, I'm onto it. It's something beautiful. So I think that living, that's why maybe literature is sheer poetry, living poetry, You move from the words into something actual. And I think that we saw happen in this very webinar for the first time. So it's been really, really wonderful. I think this would be the feeling of everyone around. I've articulated it very visibly, but I think everybody is talking about that only. The word intriguing is going on being repeated. I'm very happy with that.
Okay,
So,
with your permission, before we close, I would like to appreciate Professor Sujata Gurudev for putting her intriguing and insightful summary and kind of evaluation of the topic and the talk. Thank
thank
you,
you.
Professor Sujata Gurudev.
Thank you so much. So this has been a wonderful session, and we are deeply privileged, being participants in it and learning so much from it. And we hope to see you again and listen to you, Professor Hossain, again. And it has personally, and I think for all of us, been very, very
Oh,
illuminating.
another thing is, I usually prefer to be called by my first name. That is, my name is Masroor Shahid Hussain. So yes, I mean, I often prefer
Yes, so
name.
we will call you
Masroor.
that only, Professor Mashur Shahid Hussain. We are very, very happy to
Yeah,
have you.
thank
Yes,
you.
we'll get it very clear next time, but it's wonderful having you here. Pratusha, over to you. Yes.
yes. I think we have reached the end of the session, and this has been truly interesting and informative. We are so grateful to Professor Hussain for presenting such a wonderful paper and giving us such valuable insights. And I think we have received a lot of information, and of course, it will help us and it will guide us to if somebody is interested in doing research in this area.
Yes,
I think this presentation will be something which
it
will
is
be kind
enough.
of yes, it will guide us in a very good way. And I also express my heartful gratitude to Professor Gurudev for chairing this session in such a wonderful way and for your valuable comments on this presentation, ma'am. That
Thank you,
also
Pratusha.
was very enlightening. So I thank both of you for your valuable time and for this wonderful deliberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So so Pratusha,
And
next.
yes, and also to Professor Hussain for bringing in his mother. So
Yes,
it was a very symbolic thing, and especially, it's a kind of message to all of us that these kind of discussions on aging, disease, and death, they should not be just limited to academic presentations, but we should take it forward. And
yes,
how,
bring
yes,
in
in
touch.
terms
Yes,
of our family and in terms of our loved ones, how do we inculcate this positive thinking, and personally also, how do we embrace this process of aging, because each and every day we all are aging. So how do we do that? So that is, I think, is a lovely gesture, and personally I am so touched. So once again, thank you for doing that.
Thank
thank
you.
you. So have a wonderful day, all. Yes, I think we will move on to the next part now, Pratisha.
Yes,
Thank you, Professor Hussain.
thank
It's
you.
been wonderful.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
thank you everyone for
Thank
being
you, madam.
part of this lovely presentation. So, we break for lunch now, and it's a request to all the participants who will be presenting in the next session from 1 to 2 to be on time, because our resource person will be joining right on time. So, I request all of you to be on time, and so we break for lunch now. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Good day to all.
Yes.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. Thank you, sir.